Go to any garden center this weekend and stand in the fertilizer aisle for 5 minutes. Count the bags, count the bottles, count the numbers on the labels, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and the prices underneath them. Then ask yourself one honest question. If any of that was actually solving your soil problem, why are you back in this aisle buying the same bag you bought last spring, and the spring before that, and the spring before that? My name is Caleb Miller. I'm Amish, 50 years old, and I've farmed the same ground here in Holmes County, Ohio, that my grandfather farmed and his grandfather farmed before him. The soil in my kitchen garden has never once seen the inside of a fertilizer bag. Not in my lifetime, not in my father's lifetime, not in anyone's memory on this farm. And every August, my neighbors, the ones with the fancy bag fertilizers and the liquid feeds they mix into their watering cans, walk over to my fence and ask me what I'm doing differently. I tell them, and most of them don't believe me at first. That's fine. I didn't believe it either when my grandmother first showed me, because it looked too plain to work. Dot here quotes, "What I want you to understand before we go any further. The problem with your garden soil is almost certainly not that it's missing something from a bag. The problem is that the soil itself has forgotten how to feed itself. And the difference between those two things is the difference between buying the same bag every spring for the rest of your life and spending one afternoon doing something your soil will still be thanking you for 10 years from now." Dot. Let me explain what I mean by that, because it sounds like a farmer's saying until you understand the actual biology behind it. Dot. Healthy soil is not a pile of dirt that you add things to. It's a living system. Millions of organisms working below the surface, breaking things down, passing nutrients from one form to another, building structure in the ground that lets roots breathe and water drain the way it should. When that system is alive and working, your plants pull what they need from the ground naturally, the same way they have for thousands of years before a single bag of fertilizer existed. When that system is damaged or depleted, nothing you pour on top of it fixes the root cause. You're feeding the plant directly, bypassing the soil entirely, and the soil gets weaker every season you do it. That's why the bag never runs out of customers. It was never meant to dot. Now here's the question worth sitting with for a moment. How does soil lose that living system in the first place? Because it doesn't happen overnight, and it doesn't happen by accident. Dot. My grandmother used to walk the garden beds every spring before she planted anything. Not to plant, not to dig, just to look. She'd crouch down and run her fingers through the top few inches of earth, the way a doctor checks a pulse, slow and patient, reading something that takes years to learn to read properly. She was checking whether the ground was still alive. Not by smell alone, though she said healthy soil smells like rain on a warm stone. She was checking the texture, the color, the way it held together or fell apart between her fingers. She could tell within a few minutes whether the soil had spent the winter building itself back up or just sitting there losing ground down. What she found in our beds every spring was dark, loose earth that crumbled easily and held its shape just long enough before breaking apart. What she called willing soil, soil that wanted to grow things. And the reason it stayed that way year after year wasn't luck, and it wasn't our land being special. It was because of something she did every fall, without fail, that cost almost nothing and took about one afternoon from start to finish. Here's the method, and I want to be specific about it, because vague instructions are no use to anyone. In the first week of October, once the last harvest was in and the beds were cleared, my grandmother brewed what she called her slow feed. Not a spray, not a powder, not anything you'd find in a store. She collected whatever she'd been saving through the summer, the tops and roots of plants pulled from the beds, the dried stems of anything that had finished fruiting, the outer leaves stripped from the cabbages, the papery skins from the onion harvest. All of it went into a large clay pot, kept in the shade of the back porch, covered with well water, and left to steep. She added one specific thing to this that most people would walk right past without thinking about it. A double handful of raw sheep's wool, straight from the shearing, unwashed. Not the clean spun kind, the raw lanolin-heavy fleece that smells like the animal it came from. Now here's why that matters. And this is the part that took me the longest to fully understand, even though I watched her do it every year from the time I was small. Raw sheep's wool releases its nutrients extraordinarily slowly as it breaks down, nitrogen especially, but also sulfur and a range of trace elements that most fertilizer bags either don't include at all or include in forms that flush out of the soil within a single growing season. When you bury raw wool directly into a garden bed, shallow, about 4 to 6 inches down, it begins a slow decomposition that feeds the soil biology, not the plant directly, for 2 to 3 full years before it's fully gone. The organisms in the soil break it down at their own pace, and in doing so, they build the very network my grandmother was checking for with her fingers every spring. The steep, though, that's a separate step, and it serves a different purpose entirely. She steeped the plant material and the wool scraps together in that clay pot for 12 to 14 days. The water turned dark, almost the color of strong tea, which is exactly what she called it, garden tea. By the time she was ready to use it, it had a sharp, living smell that I can still place exactly if I close my eyes. Not unpleasant, just very much alive. That liquid, diluted with 3 parts plain water, went onto the beds before she turned any amendments into the soil. Not as a fertilizer, as a starter. She was reintroducing microbial activity to the soil before the winter amendments went in, giving the ground's own biology a running start before the cold came. Tell me something. Have you ever watched what happens to a garden bed that gets a thick layer of organic matter in the fall, versus one that gets left bare through the winter? The bare bed comes out of February gray, compacted, almost hostile. The covered bed comes out dark and workable, like it spent the winter doing something useful. Because it did. That's the soil biology at work. And the tea was my grandmother's way of making sure there was enough of it alive and active to do that work before the ground froze. But here's the honest part, and I told you from the start of this channel that I wouldn't skip the limitations. This method takes time to show its full effect. The first spring after you start it, you'll notice modest improvement, better drainage, slightly better texture, maybe a little more worm activity if you dig down and look. The second spring is where it becomes obvious. By the third year, if you've done it consistently both springs and both falls, you will have soil that genuinely behaves differently from anything around it. I'm not telling you it's a one-season miracle, because it isn't. And anyone who tells you that their soil method produces dramatic results in 90 days is either selling something or not being straight with you. I'm also not telling you this works without any attention to what you're growing or how you're rotating your crops. Soil health and planting practice are connected. You can do everything right below the ground and still exhaust certain nutrients if you plant the same heavy feeders in the same spot year after year. My grandmother rotated beds in a 4-year cycle without ever writing it down because she'd learned it young enough that it was just how things were done. If you're planting tomatoes in the same corner every season, no soil method is going to fully compensate for that over the long run. So, what does this actually cost? And this is the part where it gets almost embarrassing compared to the garden center aisle. The plant material costs you nothing. It comes from your own beds at the end of every season, the same stuff you're currently composting or throwing away. The clay pot, or any large ceramic or food-grade container, you likely already have or can find secondhand for a few dollars. The raw sheep's wool is the one thing you may need to source, and in Holmes County that's never been a problem. Any farming neighbor with sheep will sell you a pound of raw fleece for almost nothing, or in many cases give it to you for the asking, because it's a byproduct of shearing they often have in surplus. If you don't live near farms with sheep, you can find raw fleece online or at fiber art suppliers, and a single pound, which is about as much as you can hold in two cupped hands, costs somewhere around $6 to $8 and will treat a standard kitchen garden bed for 2 to 3 seasons. The entire system, first setup included, comes to somewhere around $8. And most of that is optional if you happen to know anyone with a sheep. Now, why doesn't anyone teach this at the garden center? I'll give you the same straight answer I always give when that question comes up. It's not that anybody's hiding it behind a locked door somewhere. It's simpler and a little sadder than that. A bag of fertilizer has a label, a price, a reorder date. It creates a customer who comes back every spring. Raw wool and plant tea and a clay pot in the shade of your porch creates a gardener who doesn't need to come back at all. And there's no margin in that for the people stocking those shelves. The biology of soil has been understood for a long time. The information isn't new. But information that removes the need to purchase something tends to stay quiet, because nobody's spending money to put it on a sign. Here's what I'd ask you to do this week. Not just think about and forget. Go out to your garden beds and dig down about 8 inches in the middle of a bed. Look at what you pull up. Is it dark and loose and full of activity? Or is it pale and dense and quiet? That's your baseline. That's what you're working with and what you're working toward. Then tell me in the comments what you found, what county you're in, how long you've been working that same ground, and whether you've ever seen a worm in that soil, or whether you dug through the whole thing without finding one. I read every single answer, and the patterns in what people send back are exactly how I decide what to cover next. Next time, I'm going to show you something that has nothing to do with the garden and everything to do with the walls of your house. The reason paint is actually rotting your fence from the inside, and the $20 mixture my family has used on every outbuilding on this farm for 4 generations that soaks into the wood instead of sitting on top of it, turns harder every time it rains, and has never once needed stripping or reapplication the way paint does. I think it's going to change the way you look at every painted surface on your property. Go slow this week. Mind what's underneath your feet. And remember, the people who built this country with their hands knew things we are only just starting to remember.